our third panel on working together in countering international terrorism. This discussion will be moderated by Ms. Natalie Sambi, Research Fellow at Perth US Asia Center, who is also the founder and Executive Director at Verve Research. To Ms. Sambi, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed the conference this morning so far on bilateral cooperation between Indonesia and Germany. No doubt there's been plenty of discussion on areas of bilateral cooperation, and indeed we move to a more serious phase of the conference where we start to talk about more security issues on top of women and security and climate change as well. Of course, terrorism, extremism, radicalization, these are all terms that are now staples in our transnational security vocabulary. And today we'll be discussing the points of overlap and points of common interests as is thematic for this conference of counterterrorism cooperation between Indonesia and Germany. Of course, a central commonality between the two experiences of these countries is the theater in the Middle East, the conflict that's raging between ISIS and other forces in Syria and Iraq. And of course, the return of foreign fighters has an impact both in Europe and in Southeast Asia. So to be able to begin our conversation today about bilateral cooperation in counterterrorism, we have three distinguished speakers, one from Germany and two from Indonesia. I'll spare you going through the biographies because I would really like to get into the meat of what they have to say so that we can have a very vibrant discussion at the end. I would like each speaker to speak for 15 minutes. I'll give you a bit of a notification at 15 minutes, and then we'll open up to a question and answer, and then we'll open up to the audience as well. So without much further ado, may I ask you to please put your hands together to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Kusnanto Anggara from the Defense University of Indonesia.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here actually to discuss a few things, especially on related one, countering international terrorism. The title that I have is quite tempting, probably especially for a PhD candidate, because this is cross-cutting issues and also the terminology, a differentiated approach and so on. And it could also possibly resolve some problem that actually we have. I'm happy to be here, especially because I speak before him. The most authoritative person to discuss everything related with cooperation on countering terrorism, especially. And by the way, he was my student. So everything, the lack of mine, which I possibly posed in this seminar, would be his responsibility to respond. Is it? Okay. I think the topic is quite serious, huge, and need of actually comprehensive approach, though the opportunity that we actually have, hello Mbak Dewi, is actually very much limited because there are several constraints, especially with regard of the contacting our seminar with a couple of issues related with the Indonesian non-permanent membership in the United Nations, which is basically 2019 until 2020. And I don't think that we in Indonesia will be able to do a lot of things because of the cabinet formation until sometime in October, and perhaps after October into April 2020 will still some change, especially on the government approach, institutional setup, and so on and so forth. And of course, secondly, is because terrorism is actually very comprehensive and very difficult, complex phenomena. And the UN itself is actually very much limited. Of course, it's very important within the context of norm setting, helping other for people to fulfill their obligation, setting up some international convention on combating terrorism, and so on and so forth. But national capacity to get into that kind of thing is of course different, because the common denominator among countries to cooperate with on countering terrorism is something very difficult actually to achieve. let alone if we are considering about what happened here in Germany and so on. Of course, there are some differences in social culture, in the political context, and so on and so forth. Of course, we can discuss almost everything very comprehensively, but the thing that we can realistically be hope for is, in fact, is not that much. Well, I'm not accusing myself, and I'm not actually a very pessimistic person. I'm very optimistic. Of course, there are some cooperations, can possibly be range, but there is still some limit. How to, this one? Captech, what is in English? Captech, this one, is it? Here? Huh? Okay. This one that basically I have been put as a general outlook. Basically, it's my introduction of my presentation. Yang mana ini tadi ya? Yeah, this one is everybody knows about the serious challenge that we have about counterterrorism, and I am sure that during the next 5 years, the challenge of many countries regarding terrorism would be on rise, including here in Indonesia, I guess. Do you agree? You elaborate later, right? Because of politics of identity, because of indecisiveness from the first government and so on. So the basic and very fundamental thing that we must actually achieve is strengthening state capacity to respond to that kind of thing. Yet strengthening capacity of the state is not quite easy, because they could possibly contradict with some democratic values, demarcation with humanity, human rights, and so on and so forth. And I don't know, it is quite easy actually to say that striking the balance between democracy and security, but I guess it would be more complicated at the concrete level. Especially because of different stages of development and this kind of stuff. We can possibly discuss later. Indonesia is actually very, very unique. It could be very vulnerable to many things, including because of the pluralistic social culture, social structure. There is still some issues on poverty. We are archipelagic countries basically, so it would be very difficult actually to defend or even to protect or even to manage border and this kind of stuff. So Indonesia is actually very vulnerable. But if you are looking at the index, at global terrorism index, Indonesia is not that bad, right? A 6 point something. Britain, Germany, and so on is actually even worse than Indonesia. Though, from geographic point of view, actually Germany and England, for example, is more compact, and so on and so forth. So this is also a very important thing that we have to consider, that Indonesia in reality, especially when we are discussing to the public. It is a lot easier to discuss among officials, between myself and him, for example, because we come from the same university, same perspective, we have a same learning process and so on and so forth. But it's not quite easy to talk to the people about the very important how to respond on the terrorism issues. And there is still some more issues, including, we discuss later, differences of perspective, approach, and so on and so forth among agencies. In Indonesian case, I don't know how that kind of thing would be very important within the context of Germany. It is easy, for example, to Germany for Chancellor Merkel to discuss about this kind of thing, to put some barrier on freedom of expression, on media coverage, on online word and so on, but it would be very difficult to discuss here, not only because of the social and political aspect, but also because differences among government agencies. One of those possibly is a national agencies for cyber security on the one hand, and so on and so forth. We developed quite well during the last couple of years, but it's still unfinished business on that kind of issues. Mana lagi lupa aku. Yes, yes, yeah. I just would like to emphasize this very important escalation ladder. Everybody knows terrorism is not a single event. It developed from something. It's beginning from a very, very earlier phenomenon to at the end of very coercive acts of terror. I just would like to emphasize that one about very important issues, especially because of the new technologies, because of liberalization process, because of development other places where may provide some demonstration effect to Indonesia and so on, because of the tendencies of making a smaller shell, lone wolf and this kind of thing, then the escalation leader is getting more short, meaning the time of response is getting shorter. This is very important because then it could create some other issues as well. So, legal approach, do we think or still think that it's still applicable? The answer is yes. However, what legal approach consists of, it should be eventually be broader. I don't think it's very popular just people like myself, but Dewi, for example, if I says that actually we need something extra legal approach or extra judiciary approach, meaning that of course regulation is very important. I don't think you agree with me as well. Are you? It doesn't mean that it was an unlawful approach, but there should be more creative undertaking, especially among officials. Of course, there is a rule, term of rule that should be done. Effectiveness, proportionality, avoiding unnecessary suffering, and this kind of thing is very important. But the point is, I don't think that legal approach as we know it would be very sufficient in confronting terrorism. The problem is how to define what actually allowed and not allowed within this particular context, because otherwise it's going to be a very difficult situation because the cycle of violence, because of the possibility of revenge, because of and so on and so forth. So we must be very careful on that one. I agree, of course, that prevention, sociocultural and so on and so forth is a determining factor, but in particular context, they may be necessary to use some extra legal approach where eventually accountability, professionalism and so on are becoming more important, at least at the practical level, at least at the practical level. This possibly answering some question, especially on we exercise on or the scope of cooperation. One is that, in fact, there are some non-security dimension of de-radicalizations. We discussed a lot about this one, especially in beginning in 2017 when we are reforming our law on terrorism, passed eventually in 2018, sometime in March last year, with a very thorough and long discussion about this one. Eventually we come up with the law, and which is actually required 5 and 1 special arrangement and 5 government regulations. We don't know when actually the all government or derivative regulation will eventually completed. Andika on my left just said that 4 of them is already prepared, were prepared and this kind of stuff, and possibly could be activated sometime in 2020. But the point is that we discussed already 4 years, and it need more than 5 to 7 years before eventually to complete it into the derivative law. And 2 is the issues of cyber terrorism, which is also very important. It is very difficult actually how to handle that one. I'm not saying that it's a good being or becoming in Indonesia here, because most terrorists actually exercise with conventional strategy, using conventional threat, exploded and so on and so forth, and not using cyber terrorism as yet. But if you are looking at the trend, then it's very likely in the next 5 to 10 years, it could be on the rise. We look, for example, that most Al-Qaeda, ISIL recruit, 67% is academic, at least a graduate of Diploma 1, meaning that all thesis that terrorists basically come from very marginal and so on. It could be, I don't know, but I would look from different perspective. Marginality does not necessarily in terms of economic only, but it could be something else. It could be from psychological one. The thesis, the deprivative, relative deprivations, all this is by Sir Albert Gurr, if I remember correctly, has already tell about this one. Relative deprivation is all about psychology. It's all about feeling. It's all about perception. It does not necessarily be concrete. And this is becoming a tendency everywhere, I guess. So we must actually identify what kind of threat actually we are facing. Third is intelligence-led policing, which is very important. I cannot deny the importance of intelligence. The problem is what we meant as intelligence. Because especially in Indonesian case, every agencies have their own terminology, what intelligence may scope. It could include on information gathering. It can possibly also overreach into something else, counterintelligence action and this kind of stuff. And there is no rule in Indonesia. The rule what we have in law number 17, 2011 on intelligence is not that comprehensive in Indonesia. Chief of Intelligence and Agency in Indonesia has not yet actually issued a code of conduct, special regulation on what actually to be coordinated among 17 intelligence agencies in Indonesia. There may be some conflictual perspective between police intelligence, military intelligence, state intelligence agency, and the other agency that is responsible for information gathering and so on and so forth. So this one is also a very serious challenge, especially for Indonesia. And this could possibly also impact on what kind of cooperation actually we have. It is again easy to discuss that intelligence gathering is very important, but to what extent cooperation can we possibly exercise is not going to be easy. Even between Indonesia and Germany, because of different bureaucratic structure, for example. We can of course discuss about, say, root causes of terrorism. We could possibly discuss about everything on intelligence gathering and so on and so forth. But in reality, it is very difficult to exercise. Even basically, I still doubt whether your agency have actually effective control, especially with regard to the use of capacity that actually somewhere else, including the Indonesian military, national police, and so on and so forth. The law is actually already there, but the exercise within the intelligence context is not quite easy. So that is basically the challenge. Then the academic answer would be what in my title I call it as a integrated approach, again a confusing terminology, especially in Indonesia, because in Indonesian integrating means combining. But in fact what we could possibly integrate among agencies is not their structure and organization, but is limited only on their capacity. Unless you know what actually required capacity is, it will be very difficult actually to integrate intercapacity among agencies. So I think we also would like to discuss that kind of thing. I hope that you can provide some elaboration later, especially because he was the one who responsible to design international cooperation on combating terrorism. I think I will end that one. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you.
Okay, can I sit here? Okay, let me start by first saying thank you to the CSIS and also the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for inviting me to speak on behalf of the National Counterterrorism Agency, we call it BNPT. Uh, what I had in mind today was a discussion to look into how to strengthen cooperation between Germany and Indonesia in the field of countering terrorism, and how we can bring that about, as both countries are non-permanent members of the UN Security Council. So this is something that I'd like to share a bit, and to see how far, if we want to look at both the relations between Indonesia and Germany, I think one thing that should be taken note of is that first, we do not currently have a sort of an agreement between Indonesia and Germany in relations to countering terrorism. So this is something that I think part of that inputs is that we need to garner cooperation between Indonesia and Germany. And I think some of the answers that I would like to propose here is that, and also I will also answer some of the questions that Pak Kusnanto have asked, how BNPT will actually deal with some of the pertinent issues in relations to countering terrorism. Now, what we see, if we want to compare where Indonesia is or where Germany is, there are two outcome documents coming in from the Global Peace Index that came out, I think, 2 weeks ago. That was in Global Peace Index of 2019. And the other one is the Global Terrorism Index 2018. Now, if you look at where we are at the moment, for the Global Peace Index, Germany is ranked 22 out of 163 countries, Indonesia is 41. And it is considered that both countries are countries that are considered as high state of peace countries. So we are there. If you look at the Global Peace Index, Germany fell down 4 ranks. It's because of that Germany is one of the biggest countries in exporting arms, and they're together with the US, China, and France. So the export of arms is around 75% globally, whereas Indonesia is not doing that. So we're falling, we've moved from 54 to 41 this year. So it showcases how Indonesia and Germany is at the place where we are both at the state of peace. And then when you look at the Global Terrorism Index for 2018, Germany is ranked 39 and Indonesia is ranked 42. We were in the same place in 2016, 2017. Germany went down to 1 place because there was less deaths caused by terrorism. I think in 2016, there were 16 deaths and only 1 death in 2017. So their ranking is much better. But then again, overall, if you compare this to the United States, to the United Kingdom, they're in a much better in a worse place than Indonesia, for example. And in this regard, Germany and Indonesia is considered as countries having medium impact on terrorism. So if you want to compare between 2 states, they're both in the same place at the moment if you look at the global indexes. Okay. Okay, we can do it manually. So can I turn to the next page? If you're looking at the current threats right now with Germany and Indonesia, one of the main issues right now that Pak Kusnanto has also spoken is about what do we do with the foreign terrorist fighter returnees. In Germany, if you look at the Sufan Center's report, and then also the ICSR report, there's around 915 foreign terrorist fighters coming from Germany. For Indonesia, it's around 600 foreign terrorist fighters. 657 have returned, 435 have returned to Indonesia. Then if you're looking at from 915, there are around 290 children having German citizenship and 165 women. Same thing with Indonesia. We have around 100 children that are in Indonesian situated in Syria and Iraq, and 113 women from Indonesia. So this is a problem that's coming up, and what we will do, I think one of the biggest problem is how do you return your own citizens or nationals. And again, if you look at one of the research made by Paul Burke and Jonas Vitas, is that refugees from what Germany is also experiencing is that refugees are coming in from Syria and North Africa. Most of them are being influenced by the Salafi ideology. Some of them are turning towards being radicalized by ISIS, and also I think current problem that Germany is also facing is the radicalization in prisons, where they're now looking into the prison population to radicalize. And also both countries are facing the problem of lone wolf or terrorism that are being conducted by individuals. Now, if you look at Indonesia and Germany, there are two important centers. One is, if you look into Indonesia, we have the National Counterterrorism Agency, or we call it BNPT. And in Germany, you have the Gemeinsames Terrorismusabwehrzentrum. So it's the GTAZ, or the Joint Counterterrorism Center. Both of these institutions, for Indonesia, for example, it consists of multi-actors. So within the National Counterterrorism Agency, you have the police, you have the military, you have people also like me that was working before in foreign affairs. And the same thing with with Germany. So you have also multi-actors from various agencies that are working there in the scope of intelligence as well. So the main task for Indonesia that differentiates from GTAZ is that the National Counterterrorism is an independent body, whereas the Joint Counterterrorism Center is not an independent body. The Indonesian National Counterterrorism Agency focuses on formulating national policies, strategies, and programs, and it also conducts or coordinates various agencies or various agencies as well as government ministries in implementing those strategies, programs, as well as policies. It also implements programs based on the new law, and it focuses on de-radicalization, national preparedness, and counter-radicalization, where if you look into this, Pak Kus, I believe what the National Counterterrorism Agency is focusing on now is not on law enforcement or the hard approach, but rather focusing now on the softer approach of preventing extremism, preventing terrorism. One thing that I think a good question came up from Pak Kus is how do you gather this intelligence? How do you collate this intelligence? And if you look into the new law or the revised law of number 5 of 2018, the National Counterterrorism Agency becomes a center of analysis and also a center for crisis management. But when we look at the center of analysis, it means that this agency will probably be able to collect information, and also utilize information. For example, if you look at the functions of the Joint Counterterrorism Center in Germany, it focuses on coming up with threat level assessments. So in any given time, they're providing whether there's a probability of any terror attacks. And I think at one point in time, the National Counterterrorism Agency will have that function as well, because it is the center for analysis. So this is to see how far that will go. Again, it should be stipulated in various, as what Pak Kusnanto has mentioned about derivative laws. It should be enshrined in those regulations how the National Counterterrorism Agency will liaise with other intelligence agency on how the agency could be the sole provider of inputs towards the government at the level of threat assessment that Indonesia is currently at. And I think this is something that we will look in the future as well. And bearing this in mind that both institutions, the National Counterterrorism Agency and the Joint Counterterrorism Center, are all distinguished as a fusion center. efforts in countering terrorism, I think there's the same notion of what Indonesia is doing and what Germany is doing. Germany is focusing, it has a national strategy on countering terrorism where it also looks into violent extremism. The same thing is with Indonesia. It has now a national law that has a separate chapter on prevention, which we did not have before in 2003. Germany focuses on cooperation between 40 different ministries and agencies that deals with countering terrorism. Indonesia is doing the same thing. We have the synergies of between 36 ministries and agencies focusing on counterterrorism. Germany is focusing on prevention and de-radicalization programs. Indonesia is doing the same thing. It focuses on how we can reconcile between victims and ex-terrorist convicts. We have a coordinating forum for prevention of terrorism located in 32 provinces. We have 2 pilot flagship projects that focuses on de-radicalization program outside of prison, one in East Java and the other one in North Sumatra. At the moment, Indonesia is drafting a national action plan on countering violent extremism that focuses on the softer approach. It focuses on the conditions conducive to terrorism and how, in a way, to uphold human rights as well as rule of law. And in the international sphere, in particular through ASEAN, Indonesia is the lead shepherd on counterterrorism, where Indonesia initiated the ASEAN Action Plan on preventing and countering the rise of radicalization and violent extremism that was adopted by the ASEAN Minister Meeting on Transnational Crime. These are strategies that I see there's the likeliness between 2 sides, between Indonesia and Germany. And so in order to see how we can benefit from the non-permanent membership in the UN Security Council, I think one opportunity is for Germany and Indonesia to deal with the issue of counterterrorism, but to look into it into a softer approach, because what we see from the Security Council resolutions are coming all with regard to things that are very hard approach. You're seeing, for example, Security Council Resolution 1373. You're focusing on how states could freeze assets without delays. You need a lot of things is that many of the Security Council resolutions that are coming out focuses on how countries need to better their national legislation. And in order for them to better their national legislation, they would need to make amendments to the national legislation. As we all know, many of the counterterrorism resolutions that are coming out from the Security Council are those that is invoking Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which means once it's out, it's legally binding to all states. And I think one of the problems that we faced before for Indonesia was one that was related to countering the countering financing of terrorism, where we had to make amendments 3 times to our national legislations related to money laundering, and then we had a separate legislation pertaining to terrorist financing. So again, how can Germany and Indonesia cooperate in the softer approach of dealing with the conditions that Pak Kus has mentioned before? What about the economic opportunities? What about dealing with good governance? How do you deal with the empowerment of women? How do you empower youth? How do you, all those things that are not in the security sector, rather it is in the economic and social sector. So in conclusion, both countries play a leading role in the respective regions. Indonesia plays a leading role in ASEAN. The same thing can be said when we look into Germany. It plays also a leading role in the EU. Both countries are considered countries in high peace, and their terrorism index is under medium. So that is the modalities that Indonesia and Germany can cooperate. One of the outtake for a bilateral cooperation is that there might be a need to strengthen cooperation between the BNPT and GTZ. And also, and I think one of the most important thing is how between these 2 institutions can further information and intelligence sharing. As part of the collaborative effort as non-permanent members of the Security Council, I think one of the focus would be to look into the softer side of the Security Council, something that I think would be very much palatable to many countries in the world. So this is the conclusion to my presentation. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You see, this is not Mr. Röll sitting here. This is Klaus Olshausen. But I will present you with the points that Mr. Röll has prepared for this lecture. And then, of course, in the discussion, we'll be open to bring also my personal points into play, if that fits. Now to the point paper of Mr. Röll. To be within that limit of time, he decided to limit his discussion on 2 points. I need this nice issue. On 2 points. First, how Germany's perception of the terrorism threat, and second, and this relates to many of the intelligence points made, the role of the EU Intelligence Analysis Center. Whereas our intelligence services continue to closely monitor extremism from left and right, the main threat continues to come from the so-called Islamic State. The discussion period afterwards hopefully provides sufficient time for a few examples of terrorist attacks in Germany and our concomitant countermeasures. Furthermore, in the discussion, we can also come back to the points you made where we can cooperate between Indonesia and Germany. Chancellor Merkel, in her speech at the Munich Security Conference in February 16, pointed out that alongside strained relations with Russia, the fight against terrorism is a major challenge for us. Consequently, she said, Germany will support the G5 Sahel troops which are striving to fight terrorism. We are engaged in Mali and are working to tackle terrorism there and are on the ground to train the armed forces. I inject here my own point that this was this terrorism and migration that made us active in Africa. Before that, we thought we should not support anything that comes from decolonization issues, for example, by France. So back to his text. Furthermore, at an opening ceremony at the new headquarters of Germany's Federal Intelligence Service in Berlin on Friday, February 8, she made the point that while the IS has been pushed back, it has not disappeared and has shifted his strategy to full and really back as asymmetric warfare in view of the terrorist threat. Collaboration with the United States Intelligence Service is crucial. Ladies and gentlemen, precisely how does Thomas Haldenwang, our president of the Federal Office of the Protection of the Constitution, perceive the terrorist threat? In an interview with the German newspaper Welt am Sonntag in April 14, 1990, he cautioned against underestimating the terror militia IS following its military defeat. One must at all times reckon with an attack on Germany. The headcount to potentially dangerous radical Islamists, as classified by his office, rose by 300 to 2,240 in 2018, to which figure potential returnees must also be added. The IS persists above all in the form of a virtual cyber caliphate that incites attacks. Maintaining an around-the-clock overview of all these people would be impossible, since many as 40 civil servants are required per person, so attention is thus focused on those among them considered particularly dangerous. The Domestic Intelligence Service is also concerned about the 300 children of German jihadists still living with their families in territories formerly held by the IS terrorists, militias in Syria or Iraq. At some point, they will return to Germany after having experienced violence and been subject to indoctrination. Attempted attacks in recent years indicate that adolescents could become assassins at an early age. For this reason, Haldenwang called for amendments to the law allowing children to be monitored on a case-by-case basis. Now to the role of the EU Intelligence Analysis Center in combating international terrorism. Intelligence, ladies, is not a new phenomenon in the EU. In the Treaty of Amsterdam of 1997, one reads in paragraph 6.5 of the Declaration on Establishment of a Policy Planning and Early Warning Unit that member states and the Commission shall assist the policy planning process by providing relevant information, including confidential information, to the fullest extent possible. When posted to the permanent representation of the Federal Republic in Germany, Mr. Röll, in 2001, he had the privilege of following developments in intelligence analysis with the EU. In the wake of the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington on 11 September 2001, the High Representative at that time, Xavier Solana, decided to use the existing Joint Situation Center to start producing intelligence based on classified information. On Solana's request in June 2004, the Council of the European Union agreed to establish a counter-terrorist cell within the Situation Center. This cell has tackled to produce counter-terrorist intelligence with the support of the member states. Okay. The analysis division is responsible for providing strategic analysis based on input from the security intelligence services of the member states. It is composed of various sections that treat geographical and thematic topics. The general and external relations that deal with those questions, as well as open sources analysis. It is composed of three sections. Each of which deals with IT questions, internal and external communication, as well as open source analysis, respectively. In December 2015, Federica Mogherini, the High Representative of the European Foreign Service and Vice President of the Commission, appointed Dr. Gerhard Konrad, as a German, as the intelligence director, and he is one who speaks fluent Arabic and holds a doctorate in Islamic studies. And he had his position since January 2016. Among his chief tasks are the strengthening of cooperation between European intelligence services and the provision of valuable strategic analysis to EU decision makers, including topics in and around international terrorism. What are the advantages of cooperation in the European Union? Information provided by the foreign and domestic intelligence services of the EU member states of the International Intelligence Center has the following merits. Intelligence information is garnered from different intelligence and security services, and the various expertise are pooled. The overall knowledge base is consistently augmented. The perceived threat is uniformly monitored, and the common analysis process is fostered, and joint political decisions are supported. Intelligence Center maintains further ties with the European Union Satellite Center in Torrejon, in Spain, the European Police Office, Europol, in The Hague, Eurojust, likewise in The Hague, and the EU Institute for Security Studies in Paris. And of course, the European Union Agency for Network and Information Security in Heraklion in Crete, with its expertise in cybersecurity. Furthermore, of course, the Intelligence Center liaises with foreign offices and ministries of the interior of all EU member states and is able to draw on the expertise of the special representatives in the relevant regions. More than 100 analysts, including cyber experts from the foreign and domestic intelligence services of the EU member states, are now operative within the center. Allow me to conclude my way with some recommendations which may prove helpful also for ASEAN member states. First, each country should propose analysis-based solutions for the various intelligence and security services, and other institutions may improve cooperation. Second, a watch list should be instituted and establish priorities for the analysis of present and future threats relevant for the country and the region. Third, efficient use of open source intelligence should strengthen the knowledge base. Fourth, bundling information could be a key to success. And fifth, analysis to internet websites, email traffic, and other means of communications utilized by potential terrorists. Six, information sharing between ASEAN, EU member states, and other states, predominantly between foreign intelligence and security services, would be well advised. Harnessing regional expertise on terrorism, trading information with foreign services. In order to supplement information from state sources, decision makers should also draw on the comprehensive knowledge sources of private institutions as follows: provisions of analysis on multiple aspects related to terrorism and other potential threats, provision of operative recommendations for actions containing political, economic, and military options, including worst-case scenarios, and establishing contacts to those persons and organizations concerned with terrorism worldwide. So when we talk private institutions, then we talk about non-governmental institutions, and we have seen that in prior conversations that NGOs are of great importance, not only in climate change. In the struggle against international terrorism, ladies and gentlemen, anxiety is a bad counselor. NATO has the motto, vigilance is a price for freedom. And I thank you for the attention and looking forward to this discussion. And in the discussion, we might also have more detailed information on the cooperation between Indonesia and Germany.
Well, thank you very much to our three speakers for those very comprehensive presentations. We'll turn now quickly to a quick Q&A with the speakers. I'll ask them a few questions before opening up to the audience. The first question I wanted to ask is to all three panelists. Through your presentations, there seems to be a convergence with the idea of a soft approach over than a hard approach. And Dika, you made that quite clear in your presentation. For all three speakers, Klaus, you talked about intelligence, but all the three of you, what are the priority areas for this kind of soft approach? Is it microphone there in the middle? Is it microphone, yeah.
One priority for Indonesia is that at the moment right now, we're drafting a national action plan on countering violent extremism. And that is part of the call from the Secretary General of the UN, where after the global counterterrorism strategy was established in 2006. And after certain years, the Secretary General came up with the call that member states should opt for having a national action plan on on preventing violent extremism. And part of that was to look into, when you look into the global counterterrorism strategy, it focuses on 4 areas. And this particular recommendation focused on 2 areas, which is conditions conducive to terrorism, and the other one is how to uphold rules of human rights as well as rule of law. Now, when this Secretary General came up with that proposal, was that there is a need for countries to look into the softer side of countering terrorism. Yes, there was in 2000s, I think before, there was a call war on terror, and utilizing, for example, we have the global coalition that looks into defeating Daesh. We were all using these hard words internationally. But finally, the UN said, so let's stop at looking into that. Let's focus on something that's more softer. And I think this is where Indonesia can come to play in. Because although since 2003, our laws are focusing on civilian law enforcement measures, but after 2018, when we adopted the law, there was a separate chapter on prevention. When you look at prevention, you're focusing on the softer approach of things. You're focusing on how you counter-radicalize, and that's focusing on counter-narrative, alternative narratives. you're looking into de-radicalization. When you talk about de-radicalization, this is something that the police might not be able to do, but you might need to have people from the social ministry. You might to have people looking into that program through the eyes of doctors or the Ministry of Health. So those are the things that should be coming up. When you're talking about counter-narratives, you're looking into the function of the Ministry of Communication, for example. And it's not something that is it's coming out from the law enforcement agencies or even the military. Now when you're looking into the national preparedness, again, one thing that we should take note is that when you look into national preparedness, it is the softer side of how you prevent any sort of terrorist attacks. For example, the need for capacity building of law enforcement. That is not about law enforcement, but that's about how to use strengthen law enforcement. So these are the things that are coming up, and I believe when you look at it from that sort of perspective, you're looking into the softer side of things.
Marcus, do you have a quick comment on that?
Yes. Not quite commenting actually, but it's more with a clarification of myself because I focus actually on a hard approach, right? But I think we are complementary because what he said, Andika, is basically focusing on what we can possibly do through the United Nations, right? And the other part of my presentation also mentioned that, in fact, between multilateral, regional, and even bilateral is basically mutually strengthening one on the others. One that we could possibly do at the multilateral level is good, like soft approach and so on. I support your position, and of course Indonesian position is would basically enhance about how soft approach could become a norm and this kind of stuff on handling of terrorism. But at the technical level, however, we could possibly also use a hard approach, right? At the very technical level, meaning when we are discussing about the bilateral cooperation between Indonesia and Germany, for example, we could also include this kind of thing. It does not actually about shooting, but it's about something else, which is how to become a professional military, how to become responsible national police forces, how to do everything well, accountable, and this kind of stuff. So it's somewhat basically hard in one particular aspect, but the point I would like to make is that while using a harder approach or even something extrajudicial basically, then there would be compensation is actually needed. More professionalism, more accountability, and this kind of thing. A lot of things about more basically. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Klaus?
I mean, I hear the softer approach, which is important in terms of preventing and go into the societies that you have. But you can have softer approach for your own society. You cannot hardly influence other societies in that softer approach. So we will, when we talk about softer approach, that means the UN resolutions in combating transnational terrorism are still there. So we don't give them up. We cannot give them up. But we will have to, each nation, and then this exchanging of views can look on how we can prevent radicalization, but that you have to identify first those who do the radicalization. It's not falling from the sky. There are groups that you have to identify, which you have to fight, which you have to even get ready not to be in the public sphere anymore. So this soft and hard is not, for me, the right, let's say, differentiation. I take the word of foreign policy of Mrs. Clinton when she was the foreign secretary. She said, not hard or soft, but smart. That means you have to combine those things that you can do in advance, and you have to be ready to be hard if things happen, or if you are imminent that they are happen. I would again stress that in terms of countering terrorism, intelligence, cooperation, coordination, sharing of information instead of need to know things is of utmost important. In writings, we had the word of rhetoric is always there. The rhetoric of information sharing has been there since 9/11. But when you look at the realities, the nations are still very timid or reluctant in sharing information that is not very obvious, so where you really go into details. It was mentioned that from Mr. Roll that the cooperation in intelligence for really concrete issues with the United States Intelligence Service is crucial for us. So we had several cases, and not only in Germany but also in France, where some information we got only to identify then the responsible people by having information by the United States. So I would say yes, intelligence, and all the points you made are there, but not to forget that the hard thing has to be ready if it needs to be.
Thank you, Klaus. Before we open to the audience, I just want to do one quick round. Gentlemen, I would like you to give me one word you think is the greatest barrier to Indonesian-German cooperation in this particular context, starting with Pak Kus. So at the moment, we've been far too optimistic, and I think there's a lot of potential and opportunities there, but I don't think we've got to the hard-hitting issue yet, which is what are the real barriers to practical cooperation in this counterterrorism context?
Well, it depends what we actually expect.
One word.
Oh, wonder. Incompatible organizational structure.
Okay, thank you. Lantika?
I think I would describe it as irrelevance.
Okay.
I would say culture and sitting on knowledge.
Okay, that's 3, but you go past. All right, now we're going to open up to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to ask you to introduce yourselves first. Please, your name and affiliation, and we're going to take 2 at a time. I'd like to start with you, Budewi.
Thank you very much. Excellent discussions. But I like to focus on, first the intelligence sharing, and also then what Kusnandros mentioned about that increasingly it's not those who are socially, economically marginalized, but increasingly children or young people and even middle-class families from very privileged backgrounds are becoming targets. Firstly, on intelligence sharing, I was involved in helping to draft the blueprint on countering, on the de-radicalization and so on and so forth. And we all agreed on paper, there has to be a whole, not just a whole of government approach, but a whole society approach. And it's right, it's a smart, hard, and soft one. But I remember that from the Vice President's office, we had to do it from the Vice President's office, because within Indonesian agencies, they're not willing to share intelligence, even under the coordination of the coordinating minister for security. They had to use seniority. So the policeman in BNPT would call the policeman in the ministers or the policeman in BIN. If they happen to be in the army, they were not going to share it with the police. Now I don't know how this has changed. This kinds of, so don't talk about international cooperation within in Indonesia itself. If we can buy coordination, it's there's going to be a very high price in it. So maybe Andika, because now it has been beefed up with a new law, has it been a real improvement, in the field in terms of that. And secondly, given when we used to say that it's social economic deprivation, and especially I think we need to be sensitive also that as a Muslim majority nation, for us it is much more challenging to carry out in fact, for a long time the word de-radicalization itself was not allowed, because that led to sensitivities among political parties and so on. So we need to calibrate that. So is there a new strategy that is being devised to target, when you're dealing with different segments of societies? Are there real awareness of the needs for differences? Because I think, when we look at what happened in Sri Lanka, the children of very upper, in the upper strata of economies who got involved in that terrorist attacks. In Bangladesh, a cafe bombing, apparently they're graduates of Monash University and then Islamic universities in Malaysia with link to Southeast Asia, and all the families who were involved, the father, the mother who killed their children, middle class families. The family in Batam, they were upper middle class family who all went off to Syria. So how are we aware of all of these differences and the different calibrated way of dealing with them?
Okay, thank you, Abidewi. Lady at the back, please, and then we'll go to our panel.
My name is Rachel Morrow. I've spent the last 5 years working on conflict mostly in the Middle East, and I'm starting my PhD in October. My first question is to Dr. Angoro. I'm not a pacifist, and I think that a military response to counterterrorism is an important part of the solution. But you mentioned that there's a long road that culminates in a terrorist act, and that it's not a once-off kind of occasion. My experience in Afghanistan and my research on counterterrorism in the Middle East suggests that extrajudicial or extra-legal efforts by military forces can be a major driving factor to basically push people to join terrorist organizations, to radicalize people. So what do you say to the idea that extrajudicial or extra-legal approaches only undermine the military goals of the armed forces and shore up legitimacy for terrorist groups? And my second question to Mr. Krisnayu Danto, I apologize for my horrendous pronunciation. Salafi ideology, I think, is commonly identified as a route for a lot of extremist thought, if not terrorist activity. And I think a lot of the intelligence community has known for a while that a lot of funding and imams that kind of push Salafi ideology is funded by Saudi Arabia. So my question, and I've heard, though I'm not sure if it's true, that Saudi Arabia plans to build a mosque in Jakarta every 500 meters or something, but rumors abound in these kinds of fields. But my question is, does Indonesia have a plan to monitor the flows of money, ideology, and imams, essentially, into Indonesia and the potential role that that can play in radicalization?
Thank you. All right. 3 for Andika and 1 for Pakus.
Thank you very much, and all are very hard questions to answer. I think one on intelligence, I might not be the proper person to reply intelligently, but I think the problem is that yes, there have been instances where the sharing of information between relevant agencies is always a barrier. We've always heard people from the top saying coordination is something easy to mention but hard to do. And then I think this is part of that. The problem is that usually intelligence community, they work in silo. This is something that's not happening just in Indonesia, but it's also happening in the United States, for example. The case with the 9/11 was that between various intelligence agencies, they were not sharing information. So that's why the US, they sort of came up with the national coordination mechanism where they shared intelligence, and so they have watch lists and so forth. With Indonesia, I know there has been some sort of setbacks when it comes to how they can coordinate between various agencies. And I think one of the biggest problems is not because they do not want to share, but it's inherited within our own law. For example, the law on state intelligence, it divides between various intelligence. You have intelligence, military intelligence, you have police intelligence, you have even prosecutor intelligence, you have other relevant intelligence. And bearing that in mind, how do you converge all this intelligence? And you only put one effort into saying that the BIN or BIN itself, the state intelligence, is the sole coordinator for intelligence. But it does not mean that every intelligence information has to be coordinated by the National Intelligence Agency. So, and that is why I think in one of the articles in the revised law states that the National Counterterrorism Agency will become an analysis center. And I think we need to look into the new law, to the derivative laws, to see how that will fit in, how they can build that between agencies. There's a need to share information, and between agencies there is how they collate information, and how, based on this information that are collated, then it will be utilized for the public, and including the security services in Indonesia. So this is I think this is a welcoming development, but again, I think we still need to monitor and keep an eye out how far we will have that in the regulations or the derivative regulations, whether that is regulated or not, because I think part of the, most of the time when we have a law, we're mostly satisfied, and then we forget to work on the derivative laws such as governmental regulations or presidential regulations. I think this is, and to answer Pak Kus, actually, he asked, when are all these laws going to come in force? The deadline is actually June 2019, that within 1 year, and I think it's only a couple of days left. So, so today is the 1st of July, so I missed out on that. That's one. The other thing, yes, when we look into the laws on counterterrorism, I know the issue of radicalization, the issue of radicalism. We also have a word in our law saying radical terrorism. So describe violent extremism, you describe it as radical terrorism. But the problem with the law is what they did, I think this is my personal intake, is that we define terrorism, but we did not define the other terminologies that we utilize in the law. When the National Counterterrorism Agency was embarking to have the National Action Plan on countering violent extremism, most of the critics were coming in, you don't have the word extremism in your law. So how can you come up with a presidential regulation using the word extremism? It's not stipulated in the law. So if you have the words extremism in that particular draft presidential regulation, it means you're against the law and you're focusing it on certain religion. But the case is that when you come up with a national action plan, what we want to do is address the process of radicalization. And when someone or a group of person become radicalized, the pathway is different. Some it could be it could be because of lack of economic opportunities. But if you look at, for example, the Global Terrorism Index, one of the biggest drivers of terrorism is actually conflicts that are located within your vicinity, or it's domestic conflicts as well as the international conflicts that's influencing the level of radicalization. But it could also it could be because you're being marginalized. So the pathway is there. So how do you address these pathways? And I think the means to address this pathway is not through law enforcement or security measures, but those are measures that is in the softer side. You introduce, for example, within the Ministry of Education, critical thinking. You need to address the issues of how you have tolerance within your educational curriculums. Those are the things that is being introduced into this National Action Plan. Certainly it's not about combating extremism, but what we want to do is to address the process of radicalization, that there is two push and pull factors in that regard. So this is something that I think one of the biggest problem, if you're looking into the words extremism, radicalism, is that the law did not define it. But again, you can do it with another measures. For example, the government needs to come up with better policies in place. But it certainly is not to discriminate against certain religion. On the other note, I think the third question was that
About monitoring imams' money and ideology.
how we control Saudi Arabia. I'm working in the Deputy for International Cooperation, so at any length, I have to cooperate with Saudi Arabia, bilaterally as well, regionally as well, as globally as well. But it is not how I think what we listen to. The question is this, that how far is the Salafi ideology? And I think there is 3 degrees of Salafi. I'm not a student of theology, so I don't know. I might not even be, I don't have the competence to talk about religion. But I think with the dangers of Salafi is that they have this thing about shaping a country to become based on the Sharia. And the second thing is that they do promote acts of terrorism. But, right now with Indonesia, I think we do have a good cooperation with Saudi Arabia. But again, of course, the government monitors what is coming in and out. There are many legal legal aspects of it when you have, for example, if you have a non-governmental organization going to work in Indonesia, they need to register with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There's a law on that. So if they're going to fund certain projects or programs in Indonesia, there is a law on that as well. It could be through Bappenas, it could be through the Ministry of Religion. So again, it's not about monitoring, but I think it's about supervising the various donations that are being provided to Indonesia. So again, it shouldn't be something new for Indonesia because we've had experience of donation when we look into the tsunami in Aceh a couple of years ago. So again, the mechanism is actually in place, and I think further implementation or effective implementation of those laws are important as well.
Okay. Pakus?
Doing smart is very important. I agree that the combination between hard and soft approach could be smart approach and so on. So that also applicable in many ways with what I said on the extrajudicial approach or something. Smart approach within this context, and don't say it in a law, but you could possibly done it somewhere. And that standard operating procedure would be very important. And in most cases, actually, Andika and Bu Devi, our problem is there because there is not quite well how we define about standard operating procedure actually. In the case of intelligence gathering, cooperation and so on, there was there in the article of the law number 17, 2011 actually, on how a chief of Indonesian state intelligence agency have the authority to coordinate. What is coordinated would be exercise. According to the law, exercise of cooperation between intelligence agencies in Indonesia is they met at least one monthly. There is no further regulation about what kind of standard intelligence information would be given from intelligence police, military intelligence, and so on to chief of the Indonesian intelligence agency. Until today, after 8 years of the law. So, well, I'm not blaming the chief of intelligence. I'm blaming that this is still very serious issues in Indonesian case. That's why earlier we say that saying something on cooperation at the multilateral level is easy, but going down to the earth on bilateral could be more difficult and those kind of stuff. Agree on something on principle and law could be easier, but making it effectively could be problematic. Which is good that Andika BNPT, for example, now come up with many ideas, especially with regard to de-radicalization, which is actually huge transformation from our understanding of de-radicalization in the past, which is basically focusing on, say, convicted terrorists, prisons issues, and so on. Now they have a more comprehensive because they're also focusing on, say, counter-narrative and this kind of thing. But I'm sure the problem come up next, especially because you, according to the law, is authorized to define a policy, right? And in fact, every minister also the same thing. They authorize the same policy. How you, with 3-star general, for example, basically under ministry, could possibly impose your authority to a ministerial level. Indonesia is very funny, you see, because what important here is personal relationship. It's not quite authority, it's not quite legality and this kind of stuff. But that's our problem, not our problem with within the context of cooperation with Germany as well as at international level. Thank you.
2 points on the whole of government approach. We have 16 states in our federal republic, and we have ministries in our at the federal level, and we face a similar issue, especially when something went wrong. So some terrorist attack happens afterwards, you will fix out, okay, why didn't you talk on the information you had with the other one? This would have potentially changed the situation. So when we both in your country and my country identify that, then it becomes important. How do you do that, this kind of whole of multilateral approach? I mean, let's be realistic on effective multilateralism. That might be topic-oriented, it might be case-oriented, but an effective multilateralism where we even not able to have a whole of government approach in our respective countries is an important point to discuss. Second point, radicalization, radical. I mean, I think we make a mistake if radical positions are kind of under threat. We need radicals. We need the Friday for Future people who are, or the Extinction. We need those radical positions. What we are not needing is extremism. This goes to violent action. So not all radical positions have to be de-radicalized. So what we really mean is we want to de-radicalize the kind of views that go into extremist, potentially violent action. That's where we have to be very clear.
Wonderful. Thank you, Klaus. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to keep your questions just to one at this time so we can get through as many as possible. Gentlemen in the front, please.
Thank you. Dr. Angoro started his presentation by saying the aim is the capacity of the state to respond. I think that's absolutely insufficient. What is needed is the ability of a state to prevent. And if we think about today's terrorists, they will try to make clear to the public that the states are incapable of protecting the citizens. They want to undermine the credibility of the state. If that is their aim, we have to be prepared to think the unthinkable. And if we talk here about cooperation between Indonesia and Germany, I want to raise a simple question whether the two countries would be prepared to do what the former Defense Secretary Don Rumsfeld did after 9/11. He asked, I think, a dozen of Hollywood best ghostwriters to think through how they would destroy the United States of America. So would we prepared to start an exercise between the two countries, exchanging where we stand, and task a group to say, you have to destroy Indonesia, you have to destroy Germany by means of terrorism, and present our findings, and then we learn what we have to do, and we will find all the deficiencies, like our 16 famous federal states were just a pain in the neck.
Okay, thank you. Young one in the front, in the black, yes?
Thank you. Again, my name is Rio. I'm from Universitas Diponegoro, Semarang. One of the speakers, Dr. Kusato, mentioned it's about psychology and it's about feeling. 2 years ago, the government of Indonesia blocked the application of Telegram under the pretext it's used for terrorist organizations to communicate. It's not only Indonesia is not the only one who blocked the Telegram application. Russia did it, Pakistan, Iran did it under the same pretext, and because of Telegram didn't want to sacrifice their users' privacy, and by saying that, the CEO itself saying that privacy is the most important thing other than living under threats of terrorism. This might be a philosophical question, but I think it has an ethical impact on how we practice it. What makes people feel safe? Is it knowing that there's a terrorist rampant out there and the government is doing their best, including to breach privacy, or knowing that there's terrorists out there, but the government saying, chill, we got this, or just living in a blissful ignorance, not knowing anything at all? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen, we have about 10 minutes left, so I think we'll try and get through those first.
I mean, the exercise on the devil, to think through the worst case, to prepare for prevention the worst case. That, I mean, it's normal in societies that see a certain threat. If you just fudge it over, you will always be faced with something bad, which you then have to recover from. So I think those kind of scenarios, thinking through by think tanks, it doesn't have to be the Ministry of Defense as a ministry, but to have those people to do that and to make you aware of certain things that can happen, it's important. The other point I wanted to make is when you go for prevention, then again it requires that your society is ready to do certain steps. I mean, even prevention is not only a mental thing, it costs money. And so to convince people who don't feel the threat yet that they should prepare for more resilience, that they should prepare for more in-case stuff, it's not an easy task. So we sometimes are caught by bad events because our societies are not so much willing to prepare or spend money on a potential bad outcome, only after the bad outcome has happened.
Thank you. And I think with the two scenarios, worst scenarios for Indonesia to be destroyed by terrorism or Germany to be destroyed by terrorism and focusing on prevention, I submit to that. But I think if you look into the Indonesia's legislation, there's a word called kesiapsiagaan, national preparedness. And I've been trying to look into what other countries would do in certain instances of national preparedness. I look at Japan, for example. The national preparedness for them is very much focused on earthquakes. The same thing, if I look into Australia, it's another different whole sort of understanding of what national preparedness. For Indonesia, it's national preparedness against acts of terrorism. So you can see the degree of prevention that prevails for Indonesia when we're looking into terrorism itself. So national preparedness against acts of terrorism. So this is something I think is the worst kind of scenario where we can focus our attention on. But I think the most important thing is not just this is the responsibility of the government, but this is also the responsibility of the civil society as well. Because if you want to work into the community level, you want to build resilience, it is not the government to work on that, but it would be the local community. And when you talk about local community, then you're talking, then you're dealing with the civil society. So again, it's a whole of government, but also a whole of society approach when we're discussing about prevention of terrorism. The second thing, I think the second question was a very philosophical question, whether or not we block certain social media applications. It's always this sort of context. But then again, if you look at it, for example, Indonesia, does Indonesia have a legislation on hate speech? No. But does Europe have hate speech legislation? Yes. And who's the champion of democracy and human rights? My question is whether or not I think the call is that there is the need actually for governments to work with the private sector, and there's always a need for public-private partnership. And I think this is where we need to work with the private sector as well. For example, in the case of drugs, there are companies that are selling precursors that might be utilized for manufacturing illicit drugs. But how do you catch them? Do you put all these pharmacies out of business? But what you do is you partner with these pharmacies and you ask them to monitor and supervise the precursors that they're using so it will be not utilized for illicit purposes. So these are the things I think that we can cooperate with the private sector, and also in that regards you will also uphold the freedom of expression.
Word matter. Operationalization is very important, whether we are using respond or we are using prevent, because each word could possibly have different meaning for different people, especially different agencies in Indonesian case. You ask for police, for example, about respond, and the police would be answering that, yes, we in fact have a spectrum of respond, which is beginning from the left side to the right side. You ask the Indonesian military, yes, they would likely to say respond, but they have differentiation at the operational level. In Indonesian case, of course, it's the more problematic among military in the world, for example, because they use prevent. Prevent, what do you mean by prevent by the Indonesian military? It can mean a lot, but what in the American military use the prevention is basically easy. Deny, and detect and deny before it jump actually to the third level, which is disrupt. So I think operationalization is very important, and possibly, of course, actually I need 4 semesters to answer the question, that one, because it's not quite well elaborated. And I think your challenge too, operationalization of what we meant in some regulation that we have, because otherwise there will be conflict or different lot of things among Indonesian agency. Second question is basically a difficult question between privacy and secrecy, between democracy and security. I just would like to emphasize that in fact some corrective measures necessary. Of course, maybe strengthening state capacity needs something that within particular context, time and need, the state could possibly across the border of democratic values. But at the same time, of course, the state itself should actually restrict and prepare to provide corrective action. For example, like complaint mechanism and so on and so forth, rehabilitation, restitution, and that kind of thing. The problem in Indonesia is that most state officials is talking about how to acquire more power without actually preparing to have some corrective measure. That are proper, and that your job actually is. Thank you. As a young generation.
Thank you, Marcus. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've been treated to the beginnings of a very interesting conversation between Indonesia and Germany as they head together as non-permanent members on the Security Council. Of course, the opportunity of them being on Security Council is an impetus for further development of these ideas, but hopefully this is a conversation that will continue long hereafter. So with that, I obviously ask the audience as well to think about some of the ideas that have been posed here, and each of your respective fields to start thinking about where that cooperation might go, and hopefully sometime in the future you'll be able to bring that knowledge back and to share again in a forum like this. So until then, I would like to ask you to put your hands together to please thank our 3 speakers for their contributions.
Thank you for the engaging discussions. Now we will have our last panel discussions today on reforming the United Nations Security Council that will be moderated by Mr. Andrew Mantong, researcher at Department of International Relations at CSIS. To Mr. Mantong, the floor is yours.